see. In 1982, I arrived in China to teach, by boat, incidentally. At that time, no one knew whether or not religion had survived China's Cultural Revolution that sought to stamp out all religious practice and belief. To my surprise, and the surprise of almost everyone, religion not only survived, but grew behind what was then called the bamboo curtain. In November 1989, I was flying via Berlin to the Soviet Union, where I was coordinating cultural and educational exchanges. As my plane landed in Berlin, my friend raced up to me and he said, "Did you hear?" "Hear what?" He said, "The wall. It's falling right now." We hopped in his car, we drove as fast as we could to the wall, and we were part of the crowds pulling the wall down on that day. As the Iron Curtain fell, a whole new possibility for religion in the world opened up. And then on September 11th, 2001, I was teaching in the Middle East, in a town with 20,000 Taliban. The events of that day, and those that followed, changed many things in the world, and it changed my own work and my research. Up till then, religious freedom was primarily understood as restrictions imposed by governments, such as communist governments, on religious practice. But the events of 9/11 made it clear that the actions of an individual or groups within society can have as much and even more impact on religious freedom. That set me on a course to do a social scientific study of global restrictions on religion. The data that I've been developing over the past decade have enabled conversations that weren't possible before, because I'm putting religious freedom in concrete terms and looking at it based on facts. Just last month, I was at the United Nations Human Rights Council meeting with a group of experts who are looking at the data that I'm going to share with you today as contributing to a possible early warning system for the prevention of mass atrocities and even genocide. So let's take a tour of the data that I have. First, in the world today, more than 8 in 10 people follow a religion. And even among the 16% of people who don't follow a religion, many of them engage in some religious practices or have some religious beliefs. Because religion is connected to most people in the world, it's important to ask how free someone is to practice their faith, free to practice their faith, to change their faith, or have no faith at all. But measuring religious freedom is very difficult, because how can you measure how free someone is? So instead, as a social scientist, I measure its inverse. I measure restrictions on religion coming from governments as well as from groups in society. The findings of my study show that 40% of countries in the world live in countries with high or very high religious restrictions or hostilities. But because several of these countries are very populous, about 3/4 of the world's population, or 5.1 billion people, live in countries with high religious hostilities or restrictions, the majority of which are felt by religious minorities. The findings of this study are based on a careful analysis of 198 countries and territories around the world. Each year since 2006, my team at the Pew Research Center has been carefully studying the laws and constitutions of each of these countries, as well as human rights reports from major international sources such as the United Nations, the US State Department, the European Union, Human Rights Watch, Human Rights First, Amnesty International. We study these reports, reading each one very carefully, and then we count up each government restriction on religion and each social hostility involving religion, and then add them up into indexes for each country. I'll explain that in a minute. But at first, I should mention that our research is completely neutral, or tries to be. That means if there's a restriction that's very popular or even has public support and political support, such as banning the burqa in France, we still count it as a restriction, regardless of its popularity. In that way, Pew Research is like a thermometer. We measure, but we don't diagnose or suggest a treatment. But we firmly believe that having good, solid facts can make the world a better place because it gives people common language to discuss things. But first, what is a government restriction on religion, and what's a social hostility involving religion? Let me give two examples. In Pakistan, blasphemy is punishable by imprisonment or death. That means you can be put to death for saying something or doing something considered critical of God. That's a government restriction. But recently, when two leading Pakistani politicians were assassinated because they suggested overturning the blasphemy laws, that's a social hostility involving religion. Another example from Indonesia. Ahmadiyya Muslims are considered by the Indonesian government to be heretical Muslims because they believe in a prophet that came after Muhammad. Therefore, the government confines all their activities within the mosque. They restrict their preaching, their proselytizing, their literature, and their buildings. Those are government restrictions on religion. But when mobs take action and attack Ahmadiyya Muslims, burn their mosques down, and kill them, those are social hostilities involving religion. Let's look now at government restrictions on religion in particular. Our study looks at 20 different types of government restrictions and adds them up. So the more restrictions a country has and the more intense they are, the higher the score. We find that about 2/3 of the world's population lives in countries with high or very high government restrictions on religion. In addition to those that I've already described, this includes about 1/4 of the world's countries restricting religious symbols. For instance, recently a woman was fired in Britain for wearing a cross while she was working. And the European Court of Human Rights also recently found that British law does not adequately protect an employee's right to display a religious symbol while working. In about nearly 1/3 of countries worldwide, governments imprison people based on their religion-related activities. In Burma, for instance, Buddhist monks continue to languish in prison cells for their role as clergy in supporting human rights and democracy. And in nearly 1/4 of countries worldwide, governments restrict conversion from one religion to another at either the national level or at the local level. In India, for instance, 5 of its 28 states have anti-conversion laws, which in practice are used to prevent Hindus from converting to Islam or Christianity. And if they do, social violence also often results. And I'll be talking about that connection between government restrictions on religion and social hostilities involving religion as we go on. Let's now look at social hostilities for a moment. We look at 13 different types of social hostilities involving religion, and again, the more present and the more severe, the higher a country's score. About half the world's people live in countries with high social hostilities involving religion. In addition to the ones I've mentioned already, this includes sectarian violence, which occurs in 1 in 7 countries worldwide. This, in Iraq, for instance, even though the civil war ended several years ago, sectarian violence occurs on an almost daily basis. In more than 1/3 of countries worldwide, religion-related terrorists are active. In France recently, a rabbi and 3 Jewish schoolchildren were gunned down in a brazen act of religion-related terror. And in 1/3 of countries worldwide, social groups use force or the threat of force to enforce religious norms. In Indonesia, the norm is that everyone must have a religion. It's against the law to have no religion. You must have one. When Alexander An declared on a website that he has no religion, that triggered mob violence against him. As the mobs were attacking him, the police came to intervene, and instead of arresting the mobs who were attacking him, they arrested him because they considered him blasphemous. Again, another connection between social hostilities and government restrictions on religion. One of the contributions of our study is that it allows us to track these trends over time. As I've mentioned already, 40% of countries have high or very high restrictions or hostilities today, but that's markedly different than just 4 years earlier when less than 30% of countries had high restrictions, what we call a rising tide of restrictions going around the world. Now, I'm going to give you a bit of social science by plotting each country on a chart. Each dot is a country, and the further the dot is to the right, the higher the government restrictions. And the closer it is to the top, the higher the social hostilities. And if you notice, there's many countries clustered in the bottom left-hand corner of the chart. That means a lot of countries have low government restrictions and low social hostilities. But watch what happens as we fast forward to 2010 to the bottom corner. Many countries leave that corner, and we call that, again, the rising tide of restrictions on religion. Let's focus on a few countries by looking at just the 25 most populous. I've pulled them out of the chart, and I'll blow them up to represent their population size. So China in the bottom right-hand corner is the largest bubble with the largest population. Countries among this group of countries that have relatively low religious restrictions and hostilities include Brazil, the Philippines, Japan, and the United States. There's 4 countries in particular that stand out as having very high restrictions because they're high on both indexes: Pakistan, Indonesia, Russia, and Egypt. In Egypt, for instance, religious conversion is a one-way street. The government allows you to convert into Islam, but prohibits you from converting out of Islam. In Russia, recently the mayor of Moscow said that the city can only have 4 mosques for Muslims. Only 4, despite the fact that the Muslim population has more than doubled in the last decade from 500,000 to more than 1 million today. So if you can imagine on a Friday, if they all go to mosque, that's 250,000 Muslims trying to squeeze into a mosque that's meant for a few hundred. Now, China is what social scientists call an outlier. It's the only country in this part of the chart, meaning it has very high government restrictions on religion, but only moderate social hostilities involving religion. When I speak in China to government officials, they say, well, see, this shows that our high restrictions are keeping social hostilities low. That may be, but the data say something different. In 2007, social hostilities in China involving religion were lower, and then by 2011, they're increasing. For instance, a growing number of Buddhist monks, nuns, and lay people are self-immolating or setting themselves on fire in protest of Chinese policies toward Tibet and Tibetan Buddhism. Our study also groups countries into major world religions. The main finding when we do this is we see that the Middle East and North Africa is an outlier, having the highest levels of social hostilities and government restrictions of the world regions. Arab Spring happened in 2010, 2011. What happened to the Middle East and North Africa in terms of religious freedom during this time? A time when many hoped that freedom would come as spring would come. Our study found that the Middle East and North Africa became even more of an outlier. So why is it that restrictions and hostilities are so high in the Middle East and North Africa? I can't answer that fully, but our data gives some indications. As I've mentioned, there's a connection or a strong association between a government restriction and social hostilities involving religion. The one type of government restriction that has the strongest association with social hostilities involving religion is government favoritism of one religion to the detriment or exclusion of other religions. So when you favor one, that tends to be associated with high social hostilities. How does the Middle East and North Africa score on this measure compared with the rest of the world? They're an astounding 8 times higher than the rest of the world in terms of government favoritism of religion. So therefore, it's not surprising that there would be high social hostilities in the region. Now, we can also look at the other side. Which of our types of social hostilities is most closely associated with high government restrictions? We find that sectarian violence is most strongly associated with government restrictions among the 13 we look at. So again, the Middle East and North Africa stands out on this measure as having 4 times the level of sectarian violence as the rest of the world combined. We also find that religious restrictions from one country can cross borders to another country. A young journalist in Saudi Arabia by the name of Hamza Kashgari recently tweeted some doubts about his faith on the Prophet Muhammad's birthday. That tweet was followed by death threats. And once he received these death threats, he feared for his life and fled to Australia to seek asylum. But along the way, his airplane had to stop in Malaysia to change planes. Saudi Arabia issued an extradition request for Hamza Kashgari to be sent back to Saudi Arabia to face blasphemy charges, which carries the death penalty. Malaysian authorities honored the Saudi government request, turned him over to Saudi authorities, put him on an airplane, and sent him back to Saudi Arabia, where he's in prison today. Many of the things that I've talked about today are sobering and perhaps even shocking, and many more examples could be given. Yet, the news is not all negative. This new way of looking at religious freedom through the lenses of government restrictions and social hostilities in concrete and factual terms has increased the ability of people to have discussions where discussions previously were impossible. For instance, these findings are being discussed in the United Nations, at the European Union, at the European Parliament, and in the US Congress, and creative actions are being taken in response to these data. Austria recently had the United Nations Alliance of Civilizations meeting, and at the meeting they made the rising tide of restrictions on religion a central theme of the meetings. That's part of what we're seeing as also a rising tide of initiatives to address the increase of religious restrictions and hostilities. In fact, our study found in 2011 alone, more than about 76% of countries had initiatives to address this rising tide of restrictions on religion. 22 years ago, Boris Yeltsin, the leader of Russia, the leaders of the other Soviet republics, secretly and suddenly arrived in Almaty, Kazakhstan, where I was working coordinating educational and academic exchanges with President Nazarbayev. The next morning after they arrived, they signed the papers that dissolved the Soviet Union, and that happened in my office building. A few days later, President Nazarbayev had a press conference with then Secretary of State James Baker. And at the press conference, many questions were asked, but one was asked, President Nazarbayev, will you give Kazakhstan religious freedom? He looked around the room and he said, yes, for the Muslims and for the Orthodox. And then he looked right at me and he said, and for the foreigners. Little did I know that 22 years later, I'd be able to give President Nazarbayev, still President Nazarbayev, data to see how well that initial hope has turned out. Thank you.
And thank you there to Brian Grimm.